Hi, my name's Oliver Rusk and I'm a project officer with CFA Archaeology Limited. We're a commercial archaeology unit based in Musselburgh, so just up the road from where we are here at Preston Tower. And over the past week we've been conducting an archaeological evaluation to look at the presence and character of deposits, the accumulated layers beneath the ground surface. We're peeling back the surface and taking a look, informing how sensitive the ground is with relation to the record that's buried and preserved here. So the way the ground accumulates over time happens in horizons, and it's the law of stratigraphy that we use quite commonly in archaeology to determine that as we dig down, generally we're going backwards in time, seeing how these deposits have built up. The tower itself has stood since the 1400s and has a vast history. The lower stories relating to the 15th century, and then above the parapet we have 17th century stories as well. Each layer that we encounter here represents an event in the story of the site. The deposits that we're coming on and examining now date to the 19th century and hold evidence such as clay tobacco pipe and oyster shell. Now, these are staples of working life up to the 19th century, dropped by labourers who likely themselves were tending to the monument and grounds. And we have in fact uncovered an area of mortared wall and paving that lies underneath the 19th century rubble and is of an earlier date. And we've also been able to draw some nice connections just from the material that we've had. This piece of masonry here is recognisable as part of the corbel for the parapet. So that will have fallen off at some point, and that's been contained in the rubble layer since the 19th century. So Rachel here is looking at the section and measuring from a base string line at the top, and that will be GPSed in so that we have a fixed point from which her measurements plot in the depths at which the different deposits are present.
My name's Rachel Frame. I'm a supervisor with CFA Archaeology Limited, working here at the moment at Preston Tower with the others. And for me, archaeology is the most interesting because you get to see what real people's lives were like. I started when I was younger at school, studied history and classics, all sort of the usual subjects that are available, but then as I got older I was like, well, I want to know what the real people were like, and so being able to find things like pieces of clay pipe, and this is a very common type of pottery, it's not fancy tableware, it's not going to be what the elites were necessarily using, it's more like a kitchen storage vessel. So being able to find these sorts of objects and see the real stories that aren't just what the famous people or the winners and the elites wrote down in history books is really what makes me so fascinated by archaeology, and why it gets me out here in all weathers, in full waterproofs in July, still digging, still looking to find things and see how real people lived in the past and not just what battles were won. Written history is normally, there's the famous saying, history is written by the victors. And that's very true. It's also normally throughout history written by the elite, because widespread ability to read and write is a fairly recent phenomenon. So it can be useful for giving you context, for example, the history of when the tower was built and which family lived in it. But it doesn't tell you about who was working in the kitchens and what food they were eating if it wasn't a banquet, what their normal meals were, or about what happened to this tower later in its life. There's no real written records about some of the things that happened in the 19th century, and so going through these rubble layers that we have, that Ollie's talked about, where we found things like this clay pipe and this pottery, has really helped enlighten us on a wider history and a wider story of the tower. So it gives you a better idea of what normal people like us experienced in the past, not just what the kings and the queens, how they lived their lives, everything that you get in your history textbooks.
So I obviously have a great enthusiasm for history and the past. Jobs like this, especially where it's aimed mainly at conserving the archaeological record, identifying how sensitive it is, it's really about appreciating all of the experiences that buildings like this have borne witness to, and also how these spaces play a role in the community today. So this building's been a residence, it's been a place of leisure, and now a community space. And the work that we're doing, it has a bit of scientific rigour to it. It's nice to know the parameters with which you're operating in, know the questions that you've got coming towards these projects, and be able to approach it in a controlled and systematic way. That basically means that not only are we answering questions that otherwise you wouldn't be able to reach under the ground, but we're doing it with minimal intrusion and no impact on the monument. We're actually working towards preserving the monument more wholly as a record for the future.
Obviously, we don't always find objects. Not all of archaeology is artefacts, but especially when you're dealing with more recent history, in our terms of things, it's not thousands of years old, it's only hundreds of years old. You can actually pick up and touch things. This is the fragment of a stem of a clay pipe. It would have been in somebody's mouth. They would have been smoking out of it, handling it. It would have just been in their back pocket. It's a very normal object, and it's a really physical connection to the past. And nowadays people collect these things, and there's a real sort of enthusiasm for these sort of ordinary bits of history and what you can learn about the people from them and different types of how they were made and where they were made. And this one doesn't have any maker's marks on it, but sometimes you get them and you can discover that this pipe was actually made 10 minutes down the road, and it's really local history because it was obviously used by a local person, having been made in a local factory and then lost locally or broken and discarded at work. So yeah, it's a real nice tangible link to your ancestors in the past.